Hi, I'm Annabel Willder. I'm an ESG research analyst and a member of the UBS Sustainability and Impact Institute. The Institute recently published a white paper titled Define, Align, Refine, which discusses how best to mobilize impact investing and philanthropy to deliver measurable and sustainable change. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Sam Duncan and Tom Adams to delve a little deeper into impact metrics that we touched on in the white paper, in an attempt to address the difficult question, how can investors have impact? Sam Duncan is co-founder and CEO of Net Purpose, a London-based technology startup on a mission to make impact measurement effortless for all investors by 2025. Net Purpose cleans, standardizes, and structures data on the social and environmental outcomes of companies and investment portfolios. Tom Adams is co-founder and chief strategy officer of 60 Decibels. By listening directly to any customer, employee, farmer, or beneficiary on the planet, 60 Decibels provides credible, comparable social performance data for organizations at the forefront of social impact and sustainability. So, to put a little bit of context to what we're discussing today, the UN Sustainable Development Goals were launched in 2015, and a UN Action Plan report written around the same time estimated that annually $1.5 trillion were invested in key SDG sectors in developing countries. While that might sound like a lot, the needs in developing countries are estimated to be $4 trillion annually, which leaves us with a gap of $2.5 trillion. It's a huge number. To put it in perspective, it's roughly the enterprise value of Apple, or the GDP of India or the UK. However, it's only a fraction of private wealth, which is estimated to be $400 trillion. We're seeing that private wealth is increasingly being put in towards more impactful strategies that could help close this gap. So there's been huge growth in philanthropy, really significant growth in impact investing, and huge volumes of growth in sustainable investment, and that's net new assets. So billions and billions of dollars every year of net new assets. So what is impact and what does it mean to be impactful? Part of understanding what impact is includes recognizing the difference between investing in impactful companies and having an impact on companies in which we invest. There are lots of different views on this. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Fabulous setup. Yes, and so on the concept of investor impact and company impact, I think this is a really interesting topic in the field at the moment. In particular, I think as more and more investors seek to be impact investors and think about what that actually means. And I think maybe the key segmentation of this has been defined by the IFC in their operating principles for impact, which defines an impact investor as one that has additionality and a strategic intent to create impact when they consider their investments. But at the same time, a lot of the impact in the world is actually created by companies. And I think that's what Tom and I spend our time doing, is quantifying the impact of companies and products and services on the world. As an investor in those companies, you are a key contributor in driving the growth of that impact or not. And the attribution of that impact to the investor, I think, is a topic that still people are grappling with in impact investing.
Brilliant summary. Thank you, Sam. Anything to add, Tom?
I mean, only that perhaps, I think this framing is lovely. I spend, as Sam does, all my time mostly thinking about company impacts. And I think there's still so much work to do to define and get systems in place to do standardized company-based impact across all the plethora of social issues there are in the world. And that's going to take a long time. Investor impact is, as Sam said, all about attribution. I like your words here in terms of encourage improvement. The thing that I'd like to see, that's the nice way of saying demand accountability. And I think that maybe that's the real role that an investor can play, is demand accountability to themselves and also of the companies, that they're really taking impact measurement and impact performance as seriously as we ought to be.
Thank you so much, both. So we think it could be valuable to think about how capital is translated into impact by considering a contribution factor. In this equation, impact equals capital times contribution. So impact equals capital times contribution. Theoretically, putting additional capital at work in an investment or philanthropic product with a higher contribution factor would create greater impact. So theoretically, we think contribution factor should align with intentionality. So if you've got a higher intentionality to create impact in what you're doing, it should equal a higher contribution factor. So then that contribution factor is multiplied by capital, and that gets you to the total impact. So of all the strategies, we have exclusion, ESG integration, sustainable investing, impact investing, and philanthropy. So if you think about a bell curve, at one end, with exclusion, you might end up with a fairly low contribution factor, but a lot of capital. So that might be at kind of this side of the graph. And then as you move up towards sustainable investing, you've got quite a lot of capital and a moderate contribution factor. And that might be about the peak of this bell curve. And then as you move towards philanthropy, theoretically the most direct link to impact, you would have a high contribution factor but relatively low capital. So you're moving back down to the other tail of the bell curve. So what we want to think about today is how the factors in the equation might change so we ultimately create greater impact, whether that's by increasing the capital allocated towards those funding types or companies with higher contribution factor, or increasing the contribution factor of funding types or companies that already have a really high capital allocation. Sam and Tom, you're both experts in impact data. Do you think this is the right way or on the right track to thinking about this issue?
Do you want me to start? So I love the stake in the ground that you're putting with this concept. I think it is in the right direction. And I'd maybe say a couple of things on it because I feel like it brings together a couple of key topics that are out there today in terms of how we think about impact measurement, really. Because I think the classic goal here is to get to a world where investors can think about allocating their capital across an impact spectrum and recognizing that varying types of capital will have different levels of impact. And we first need to be able to measure that impact in a consistent way. And I think we're both working on that, and a lot of the industry is working on getting numbers on a page to start with today. But once you've got those numbers on a page, thinking then about how that leads to different decision making is absolutely the right step forward. So I do think that when we get these numbers on a page, what we're seeing is certainly that impact exists across the entire capital chain. So I think the first concept to get comfortable with is the fact that impact doesn't only exist in philanthropy or in impact investments. It can actually exist across different companies in sustainable investments, in traditional investments. Every single company or organization has an impact. And being able to quantify that or measure it qualitatively, consistently across that entire capital spectrum is the first piece, but also I think a first good recognition, because I think until now, a lot of us have thought of impact only existing in these side classes, which is just not the case. Then I think if we can get consistent measurement across all spectrums of the capital chain, I definitely think it is clear, and in our evidence is increasingly clear, that different parts of the story have different levels of impact. And I think certainly with SFDR regulation and climate intensity metrics, a lot of the time we have measured climate as an intensity metric on market cap enterprise value today, and that's guided by an EU regulation. So thinking about that concept of carbon per dollar of enterprise value, really, you could think about doing that across other themes as well. And we do see, from a positive impact perspective, certainly a difference in impact per $1 million. For example, number of people reached with access to finance or number of patients treated with healthcare. A lower per $1 million impact for listed companies than for private companies. And I think that's also quite a neat quantitative way to show that you can have different impact in different asset classes. And then for an investor, you can start to think about your portfolio in those terms as well as your financial return terms. I think the only other thing I would add to this is when we have been looking at the data, we have looked at that intensity, like kind of capital contribution of impact, but also year-on-year growth in impact, which is very similar to the way we think about financial performance and not measuring kind of absolute revenue metric, but also overall year-on-year growth and year-on-year growth in return.
So for me, when I saw it first as an equation, I thought, oh, this feels potentially like a reinvention of some of the wheels we already have in terms of social return on investment. And then there was the impact multiplier of money that Bridgespan, I think, came out with. And I thought, oh, okay, what's new here? But then when you explained it as a bell curve, I started to think, okay, there's something very valuable here because it's a hypothesis. What you're essentially saying is we've got a hypothesis of how these different types of capital will create impact. And then there's a spectrum to it. And if that holds, that's really, really interesting because, or is it, as putting that forward is really interesting because what we tend to find is people start with, oh, there's a funding gap of 2.4 trillion. Great, money. Let's just throw money and we'll just record how much money is going to places. And it's just then it's going to miraculously turn out that all the impact in the world has happened. But actually you're taking it a step further and saying, well, different types of money may have different values of impact. And let's start to test that. And then if we find out what the theory turns into practice, we actually can say different types of money have different types of contribution factors. Then what do we do with it? We need different types of money. How do we encourage different types of pots of funding in different places? Of course, the challenge, but this is what Sam and I spent all our time thinking about is, well, what is that contribution factor really? And do we have enough data to reliably assess different contribution factors of different types of money? Which is where we could spend probably time boring all of your audience to tears about the sorts of data we need to start getting under that contribution factor and of different places and how challenging that will be. That's not going to be an overnight thing. And Sam and I work at different ends of the spectrums of data, from Sam doing incredible work on environmental and health impacts and us doing very micro-based work, listening to people about their lived experience and their perceptions of what social value is to them. And one day we'll be able to have more streams of those data that will talk to one another and we'll be able to answer questions like this. So what I like about it is it actually is UBS having a hypothesis of what sorts of different types of capital might create change. And then we could actually start to test that and get beyond just, we do need huge sums of money to solve some of these challenges, but it's not just about money, it's about the effectiveness of that money.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, really interesting answers. And Tom, you touched on it. You're kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum a little bit. Sam working on qualitative data more so, and Tom on other way around. Tom working on qualitative data and Sam working on quantitative data a bit more. How does qualitative data differ from quantitative impact, and why is the distinction important?
I'd argue our data is also both qualitative and quantitative. And perhaps the question is, again, so often data gets labeled as one thing or another, and therefore has some sort of sense that people say, well, this is better or more high quality data than another. This is just subjective. We get a lot of criticism when we listen to people about their lived experience. Oh, that's just subjective data. That's subjective data. That's not as powerful as hard data. And then I have to explain to people that every single pain medication they've ever taken in their life is based on subjective data. It's based on our assessment of whether, it's not like we were taking pain medication and there was some big scientific thing that scanned people's brains and went, that works better than another. Groups of people would take one drug, groups of people took a placebo. If that on average group of people said there's less pain, then we say that drug works. And the whole world takes these pain medications all the time and they work, and we understand that. And so asking people about their lived experience, asking people to describe their own perceptions of impact and how material that is often we collect in a combination of qualitative data, which we can then turn into quantitative data, and it's subjective data, but it is just as hard, I would say, as objective data. And the world works on all of our subjections all the time. When we go and buy something, we choose something, we're making a subjective choice about value all the time. It's just turned into an objective number because we spent some money on it. And so what we're doing is listening to people, allowing them to describe the materiality of social changes, whether they be, and to make it tangible, whether they be their perception of their personal safety or their perception of the quality of education or they're just overall assessment of their personal autonomy, how much they can achieve their ambitions. All of these things, for example, when we create social change, we're lifting people's horizons of what they might achieve in their life. And they can say, right, I actually believe I can get onwards and upwards. That's the fundamentals of social mobility. And that might be something we talk about in terms of creating impact. Anyway, so all our data is of that kind, which we're asking people to describe their lived experience, asking them to assess their own personal well-being. And then we turn that into what I would describe as quantitative, hard data on social well-being. And we're trying to do that at a very bottom-up approach with hundreds and soon, well, actually thousands in a year of social change organizations across now more than 70 countries in a standardized way so that more and more of this data can start to build up. And the surprising thing to me is that actually those systems have never been built before. This sort of work of social research has tended to be dominated by academia and stay in academia. But repeatable models for organizations to use to actually ask these questions of their customers or employees haven't been available. And so that's what we're trying to do. And so one day this type of subjective data will form very objective measures of social performance that all organizations will be able to use.
Yeah, like it has done, as you said, in the medical industry.
Right.
So maybe people are just misunderstanding it. As I asked the question, a little bit of a misunderstanding of how it's kind of framed. But also, I think it's really tough what you're doing. I think quantitative data, there's so much of it. Lots of people are used to working with it. Maybe they're just a bit scared of qualitative data, and you're doing the hard work. Are the technologies and AI helping compile this, or is it?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, we could get into about the depths of sort of social research and the technicalities of how to ensure that data you collect on people's perceptions of their lived experiences is as reliable as it possibly can be. There are all sorts of biases that creep into the way in which you might survey people in terms of perceptions of social desirability. What does the person asking me think I want to tell them? And there are loads of different ways you can start to control for that. And maybe AI listening to tones of people's answers as well as what they say, or even one day this is really creepy, recording facial imagery and the way the face is saying something, the words are different to the tone, is different to the facial expression, and we can get closer to a quote unquote truth is possible. Thus far, none of those things are as scalable as simply picking up a phone and asking someone. And we live with some of the potentials for bias in our data, but we create benchmarks. And as long as you're asking questions in the same way, using the same controls, all the data might be 10% greater than the quote unquote truth, but we can compare organizations and index organizations and then create reliable measures of performance. And ultimately, it's performance that matters. Back to your contribution question, it's the performance of all those organizations and getting better information around all of these organizations' performance.
Brilliant. So we saw earlier that we're improving on the kind of capital part of that equation with growing funding towards perhaps more intentionality, but sustainable investing, impact investing, and philanthropy. Are there any signals or evidence in the work that the both of you do on how the contribution factor can improve?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to being able to measure contribution, which we're both working quite hard on. But I do think there's been a lot of advances on that topic. I mean, I feel like we're kind of nearly approaching convergence in the way that we think about and quantify and in multiple different dimensions, impact or outcomes and outputs. And I think on that front, the International Accounting Standards Board launching the sustainability standards is a big step forward, and that being driven and contributed to by the Impact Management Project, IRIS Plus at the Global Impact Investing Network, GRI, SASB, EU SFDR. There's still a number of acronyms there, but I feel like there are fewer acronyms than there were a number of years ago. And so getting common agreement on what those metrics and contributions that the world seeks to achieve are, I think is somewhere we're making a lot of progress. I mean, and I think across key themes like climate, water, waste, gender diversity, racial diversity, access to essential services like financial inclusion, healthcare, affordable housing, there are very clear metrics now that, the UN SDGs have prescribed, the Sustainable Development Goals, but that all of these other standards are kind of rallying around. And so I think what to measure and that conversation is miles ahead of where it was a couple of years ago. Now I think it's about getting the data points in those fields so that an investor can access consistent information across an entire set of investment opportunities and decide where to put their money based on the impact that that investment opportunity can have. That's, I think, the key challenge. And I think that's where Tom and I are playing in terms of gathering that information together and making it effortless to use. Yeah. And
do you find, I mean, obviously you've touched on regulations a little bit, huge incoming regulations in the EU around this. Do you think that's going to be a huge help to what you're both doing?
Yes.
Perhaps slightly more Sam than Tom, but...
Definitely Sam and Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think regulation is a fabulous driver for a lot of this. I think that some of the key topics, and certainly where the EU has started with regulation around climate, have now been very well evolved, right, with the GHG reporting protocol and other things, such that we have pretty common understanding of what we should be measuring on climate and goaling around. I think other areas like wastewater and social themes are less evolved, frankly, and I think also reflected in the technical standards that are being developed subsequently. But yes, I think it's a contribution. I think when regulation comes in, I think where we've started with regulation is actually quite ambitious, which is a great place to be, but also on one kind of key topic for the world right now, climate. So I think there's a long way to go. And I think there's a lot of advances that are a bit further ahead than that, but super excited for it to come in. I think standardization is key. And
I mean, the thing I would add to this, and this is somewhat on perhaps some of the new controversial topics that are coming up around this. A long time ago, we'd have been just having whether or not you had to measure was sort of a controversial topic. and we have moved so far from there. But now we're asking questions, I think, of regulation of who's this regulation designed for. And some of the things that we see around it is what is considered in the contribution to be material and who gets to judge that. And some of the critiques I'd have of some of the regulations are that it's looking at single materiality, just the social and environmental impacts that matter to financial returns, which exclude many, many social and environmental impacts listed in the SDGs that have nothing to do with financial returns. The most obvious of that being inequality. But then there are some regulations that are saying, no, actually, we need to go beyond single materiality. We're going to top this up and go for double materiality, particularly in the climate space, and say we actually have to hold you to account, organizations, profits, all organizations to account for their social impact, even if it has nothing to do with traditional shareholder value. That's a very exciting place. But we're going to see, as the metrics get better and better, we're going to have better and better conversations around where do we have single materiality and double materiality, and which parts of the capital spectrum, which sectors, is there still significant social and environmental externalities that are not captured by a single materiality approach. And then I think we'll have better and better conversations about where we need to top up regulation to push organizations and investors of capital towards double materiality.
Brilliant. Yeah, and then stepping back to kind of from an investor perspective, many people think of impact investing, as you kind of touched on, is really limited to private markets. That largely takes retail investors out of the picture. So is that really the case? And if it's not, what can retail investors look for?
This is my world, Sam. I'm dodging this question.
Okay. So I think that's a true statement, and I hope, and we are trying to build a world where that actually isn't true anymore, and that every single investor in the world can be an impact investor. And I think that does require quite significant advances in measuring contribution and impact across different asset classes. But also I think at the moment, impact investing is very deeply rooted in this concept of additionality as an investor, that you need to really be supporting the company to actually create impact. And if you're not doing that, then you're not an impact investor. And I think
excludes retail investors.
Which excludes,
really.
because a retail investor can't really jump in and sit on a board and, get ExxonMobil to change like engine number 1 did, which is fabulous to see. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it's an open topic. I think one thing that resonates with me when I think about this is the way that we drive around financial performance. Every investor in the world can drive around and does drive around financial performance in an investment portfolio. And the way they do that is based on the thought of performance, right? Like I'm targeting a year-on-year return of 5 to 10% or 20 or 30%, and I make decisions based on that change that I'm expecting. And I'm a financial investor, regardless of which percentile I achieve on that trajectory. I hope the same could be true for impact at some point, where you can quantify impact in the same way and target an impact year-on-year growth or year-on-year degrowth for carbon emissions of 7% to achieve 2 degrees. And if you achieve that or if you don't achieve it, that's, I think, still an intentionality, a classic of intentionality that's quite clear and that can be available to everyone versus needing to kind of actually get additional on the, engagement front to actually have an impact. So personally, I feel like that's where we could head if we get to a world where you can quantify impact across asset classes, and then impact investing is open to everyone.
The dream.
Yeah, the dream and the trillions of dollar dream that's necessary to actually achieve meaningful shifts. Because if we keep it in this small part of the spectrum, we're never going to achieve that amount of capital flowing towards impact investments.
Anything to add, Tom?
No. Spot on, Sam.
So perhaps a kind of final, hopefully optimistic question. How might this space change in the future? We've kind of talked about it a little bit. And of course, at the risk of adding yet more jargon to this space, if we know a company's contribution factor, could it help fill that $2.5 trillion gap?
I think significantly more information about performance is absolutely critical to moving from, we need huge sums of money. I mean, 2.5 trillion is I don't know the details of that number, but I imagine there's a spreadsheet somewhere which is open to quite considerable shifts if you make some different assumptions that move it to 3 trillion or 5 trillion or 50 trillion, And so it's really, the matter is about getting to performance, like how effective is capital at achieving social outcomes? We're still quite far from that, in truth. There's a lot of work to be done, but we're significantly closer to it than we were 5-10 years ago. And I think the rate of change and the awareness of the need for better information is increasing. I mean, we sometimes write articles and we may be we're probably as an organization on the forefront of saying, actually, materiality has to be defined by end beneficiaries, and we definitely need double materiality. And we're quite idealistic about those things as an organization at 60 Decibels, and we'll keep hammering away at that. But 5 years ago, so sometimes I'll be frustrated that ESG investing doesn't really consider double materiality, and there'll be huge impacts that are important to the SDGs that will be excluded with today's current investing. But 5 years ago, ESG investing was pretty niche, and now it's getting more and more mainstream. And if the rate of change of that's going to happen, then I think in 10 years' time, we're going to be talking about double materiality across more and more sectors and better information driving this. And I think so I'm very optimistic about the rate of change, and the conversations are going to be improved, and the quality of data to improve those conversations. And we'll come back in 5 years' time, and we'll be able to put specific asset classes on your bell curve and say, this one is outperforming, the contribution factor of this is this, and be able to then suggest where we need more capital to drive change.
And as you said, if they're outperforming on the contribution factor, maybe that's a reason to invest rather than financial performance. So it'll be interesting to see how it develops. Did you have any other thoughts, Sam?
No, I think it's perfectly summarised as well. I mean, if we get back to this point and we're looking at a chart and we're talking about the different contributions, I mean, that's the goal, I think, right now. Let's get all that data on a page and be able to have those conversations.
Brilliant. Well, that's the hard work that you guys are doing. So thank you so much, Sam and Tom. Really insightful discussion. And thank you to everyone watching. Please keep an eye out for more from the UBS Sustainability and Impact Institute.